In the 150-year history of Jehovah's Witnesses, the religion's leaders have said and written some quite shocking things. Today, we're going to analyse some extraordinary old quotes.
There is no servant in the world as good as a good coloured servant.
And dare I say, some even more extraordinary new ones.
Look at that little enemy of God.
Be prepared to be appalled and slightly disgusted as Riley and I count down the 10 most shocking Jehovah's Witness quotes of all time.
Harrison COVID is no longer one of Jehovah's Witnesses.
Now I know what you might be thinking. Harrison, you're not in your living room this time, you're out in the middle of nowhere in this forest near Oxford. What's going on? Well, earlier today, some ex-Jehovah's Witnesses, including myself and Riley from his channel Jexit 2020, met up for a lovely XJW lunch. I couldn't pass up this opportunity to meet Riley and be with him without taking advantage of his company and getting him involved in a video. So Riley, thanks for being in the video today.
Thank you.
I want to start by asking you, when I first put this idea forward to you, this concept, what was your first reaction?
I thought it was an ideal subject for a video, especially in light of recent comments made by Stephen Lear. I thought it was very timely and just, spot on.
That will be in the top 10 for those who keep up to date with XJW content. It's coming.
Look at that little enemy of God.
Riley, as you were kind of doing your research and preparation, was it easy for you to look at these quotes and to narrow them down, or was it difficult?
It was extremely difficult because they've said so many shocking things over the years. The hardest part of my research was just narrowing it down to a short list.
No, I felt the same way. And I thought, how am I going to do this? But this is our combined list. So this is just our subjective opinion. There will be many other quotes from over the years, extraordinary bad and shocking quotes that we aren't including today. So make sure if you know some quotes, XJW quotes, put them in the comment section below. But perhaps before we go into the top 10, Riley, there were a few things which we haven't included in the top 10, but maybe deserve a noteworthy mention. So would you like to start those off?
Yeah, absolutely. So the first one was written in the Golden Age magazine, the June 26, 1929 edition. The Golden Age magazine was the forerunner of what we call today the Awake magazine. So they had an article in there about the differences in facial features between races. And I'll just read directly from it. It says, "All this is fully in accord with the Bible, which tells us that man is degenerate. Thus, these abnormal racial differences are the product of disease." And they've actually got a chart showing the different shapes of noses between different races. And they're saying that this is degenerate and it's a product of disease.
See, this, I was saying to Riley beforehand, this is what happens when you have an organisation which is so unfamiliar with evolution and the mechanics of how it operates, that you have an idea of what God created in the beginning. And normally in the minds of white people, Jesus and Adam and Eve are white. And so anything except from that is like, hold on, something must have gone wrong here.
Exactly.
Now, if we think that's bad, you wait till what's coming up in the top 10. There are two other quite racist quotes coming up, so look out for those. Riley, do you want to present to us number 10?
So this quote is taken from the February 22nd, 1984 Awake magazine. The article is entitled, "They Resisted Rapists." And this is what it says under the subheading, "Treat him respectfully." "The intended victim should remember that the rapist is a human. No doubt there are circumstances in his life that have precipitated his behaviour." So this article is actually advising women who are under the threat of rape to treat their rapist with respect and remember that they are a human being who have had some unfortunate life circumstances that has led them to this point. And I can't think of a word worse than shocking to give to this.
Well, obviously, what respect did the rapist show for the victim?
Exactly.
Zero. Now, this is obviously where this kind of idealistic mindset of let's love everyone regardless of whatever they've done in the past. This is where we have problems, because to a person who's non-religious, they're obviously going to say, why should I have to treat him with respect? And I think this is the problem. This doesn't give you the free will. The title is a command, isn't it? Treat him respectfully. Not, you could treat him respectfully, but it's up to you. Maybe if your circumstance was terrible, you don't have to treat him with respect. This is, treat him respectfully. He's a fellow human. And I just think it takes away your autonomy to make your own decision on how you're going to view someone who's done that atrocious crime against you. For number 9, I've got you a little present. There we go.
Thank you.
So, the harp of God. So if me and Riley were on the ministry 100 years ago, we'd have been going around door to door, leaving people a copy of the harp of God. But notice there is a secondary title down here. Riley, what's that secondary title?
Proof conclusive that millions now living will never die.
Okay, proof conclusive, otherwise conclusive proof, conclusive evidence. If you go into a courtroom with conclusive evidence, that means it's beyond doubt. No one can say, no, I don't believe the evidence, because it's something like DNA, it's something like a fingerprint. It's like, you can't forge that, you can't make it up. This is real, this isn't fiction. This is from Jehovah God to the world at that time. These were being placed from door to door, and this was a promise that millions now living will never die. If you were to Google how many people today are over 100, so were actually alive when this promise was made by the organisation, you'll see that it says 316,600. Not even a million, let alone millions now living will never die. You know what this reminds me of, Riley?
What's it remind you of?
Another famous religious leader who promised people of his day and age, his generation, should I say, that they wouldn't pass away, and yet surprisingly they're all dead too. Now, speaking of being dead, let's move into number 8. Riley.
So this quote is from the Watchtower magazine, 2011 February 15th edition, and on page 32 it says, "By cutting off contact with a disfellowshipped or disassociated one, you are showing that you hate the attitudes and actions that led to that outcome. However, you are also showing that you love the wrongdoer enough to do what is best for him or her. Your loyalty to Jehovah may increase the likelihood that the disciplined one will repent and return to Jehovah."
Wow. I mean, this is very difficult, because to someone who's not been personally affected by this, to just a member of the public who's watching this video, you may think, okay, well, what does this involve? What is shunning? This is talking about cutting off contact. This is all forms of contact. And there are other quotes in the past, if you go on JW Facts, about not even emailing, saying hi. If you get a phone call, ignoring the phone call and putting it to one side. Let's imagine that your daughter is going into birth or something like that, or she's just been mugged, or even worse, who knows what's happening to a family member. Ignore the phone call, because that is the loving thing to do. Riley, I want to ask you a couple of questions based on the quote you just produced. It says, by cutting off contact with the individual, you're showing that you hate the attitudes and actions that led to that outcome. Now, in the mind of a Jehovah's Witness, they're thinking, yeah, proud, individual, sinner. But in reality, for someone to choose to disassociate themselves, which is what I did, or to get disfellowshipped because you no longer believe that the religion's the truth, often it's the opposite. Often you're searching for the truth, right? But it just doesn't end up being the religion. Would you say that's fair?
Yeah, oh, absolutely, without a doubt.
And it says next, you're showing that you love the wrongdoer enough to do what is best for him or her. I can't help but laugh at that. Do you feel like the treatment you've received after leaving Jehovah's Witnesses has been loving?
Oh, nowhere near it. Nowhere near it. I mean, in my case, I wouldn't say that the treatment and the shunning that I've received is making me more likely to return.
Well, that's what the very next sentence was, wasn't it? It's going to increase the likelihood that you will return, but you're saying it's not.
No, definitely not in my case, because I've actually seen how abusive this is. I mean, that statement there is just emotional blackmail spelled out. So why would I want to go back to an organisation that would resort to such tactics to keep their members in?
And I think a few people who used to know me as a Jehovah's Witness, who I've talked to, just the odd one or two, because most people shun me, obviously, they may wonder why this at one time spiritual individual, this nice person, has gone AWOL, has just lost the plot and set up this apostate YouTube channel. when you wake up and you realise it's not the truth, you have three options. You either get disfellowshipped, disassociate, or you try and fade from the religion and go kind of undercover, just escape gradually without the elders chasing you down, or maybe you ignore the elders. They put a gun to your head basically and say, if you're going to talk to anyone else, if you're going to share any of your views which are no longer that of the religion, we will punish you in this regard. And so many people wonder, why did I set up this YouTube channel? Well, how do you like to be blackmailed? How would you like it if someone said to you, do this or you'll lose your family? I'm not sure about you, but my immediate reaction is to stick a middle finger up and tell them where they can go. I do not respond well to blackmail. So the organisation, through these policies, bring this sort of backlash on social media to themselves. Let's move into point number 7. We're going to be mentioning a couple of times Face the Facts, this organisation who have constantly brought us facts over the years. I've entitled it Face the Fiction. Now, Riley, when you were in the organisation, what percentage of the congregation do you think were unfulfilled, potentially lonely, or even depressed because they'd gone past the point of finding a legitimate mate in the organisation of their own age range? They were now on the shelf for the rest of their life. Or maybe they chose not to have kids because Armageddon was coming so soon. Or maybe they decided, I'm not going to marry so I can pioneer and serve Jehovah. Were there many in that position?
I'd say the vast majority of the congregation falls into one of those categories, at least one. Some, for most people, I'd say they fall into multiple categories.
Because when I was in the religion, I completely agree with you, most of the congregation, but myself as well. I was unfulfilled. You could not express any form of sexuality. You had to completely deny yourself and repress your soul. And you act like everything's okay. I think most people do in the congregation, but deep down, they can't leave, they can't express themselves. And they can't have sometimes kids and a partner, and it leads to the most tragic of outcomes. Now let's use a recent quote here. Why do they do this to themselves? 2020 Watchtower, August. Many brothers and sisters have chosen to remain single. Married couples have postponed having children. All have made these decisions for one important reason. They want to serve Jehovah as fully as possible. They are content and trust that Jehovah will provide all the things they truly need. Will they be disappointed? No. The problem is, I mean, if Armageddon came next year, that's fine, they were right. But what most Jehovah's Witnesses don't know, Riley, is that this organisation has been spewing out the same message almost since its inception. The Awake of 1969. If you are a young person, how old is young? Maybe 19? 19's a young person to me. If you're a young person, you need to face the fact that you will never grow old in this present system of things. So if you're 19 in 1969, you're now 72. Speaking of facing the facts, the booklet Face the Facts says this, and this was in 1938. Would it be scripturally proper for them now to marry and begin to rear children? No, is the answer, which is supported by the scripture. Those who now contemplate marriage, it would seem, would do better if they wait a few years until the fiery storm of Armageddon is gone. Now, it wouldn't be presumptuous of me, based on the evidence that we've just looked at, to say that this organisation has a track record of lying. But governing body member Jeffrey Jackson believes that there is something that would be presumptuous. Riley, what is the 6th most shocking quote of all time?
Well, during the Australia Royal Commission, which was an investigation set up by the Australian government to look into organisational responses into child abuse, Jeffrey Jackson was asked a very specific question, and I think we have a video clip of that.
And do you see yourselves as Jehovah God's spokespeople on earth?
That, I think, would seem to be quite presumptuous to say that we are the only spokesperson that God is using.
So the clip is, do you see yourselves as Jehovah God's spokespeople on earth? and then he said, that would be, I think, would seem to be quite presumptuous to say that we are the only spokesperson that God is using.
Yeah. When I first saw this clip, it absolutely floored me. I literally almost fell off my chair. I could not believe what I was hearing, because Either Jeffrey Jackson was lying to the Royal Commission, or the organisation has been lying to Jehovah's Witnesses for decades. Either way, it's still a lie.
It's extraordinary, that's the only word I can use, that he refrained from telling the truth, that he refrained from saying, yes, of course, we're Jehovah God's only spokespeople on earth, which is what every Jehovah's Witness honestly believes. I mean, had you woken up by the point where you were watching the Australian Royal Commission?
I was just starting to wake up, and that was just like the final nail in the coffin.
It's so tragic that more Jehovah's Witnesses don't watch stuff like this. I mean, this isn't being broadcast around Kingdom Halls. This would wake so many people up.
I mean, this happened in 2015, if I remember rightly.
Yeah.
I left the organisation in 2019, and I had no idea that this even took place. And I'm sure that that is the case with the vast majority of Jehovah's Witnesses. They've never heard of this.
Before we get into the top 5, I do want to kind of stand on the sense of the defence and the opposition for a second. Because if you're a Jehovah's Witness watching this, firstly, naughty. Secondly, you're probably saying, well, come on, this is unfair. This isn't right. If I had a microphone attached to me my whole life and someone were to take little snippets of me saying the F word, or me calling someone this or that, or me behaving in this manner, you'd paint a very negative picture of me, which might not essentially be the whole picture. Jehovah's Witnesses have put out a lot of information, a hell of a lot of information in the last 150 years. Is it really fair to just take their most shocking and their most disgusting bits and say, well, this is what the organisation is? How would you respond to that?
Firstly, I'd say that that is a very, very fair point. But the way I'd respond to that is by saying, most people don't claim to be God's mouthpiece on earth. Most people don't claim to have a direct channel from Jehovah God. So as far as I'm concerned, anything that the witnesses have said since the year 1919, which is when they believe Jesus appointed them to be his religion on earth, anything they say after that is fair game.
Some scholars feel that the original pronunciation was closer to Yahweh rather than Jehovah. Others feel that it may have been Jehovah. Just how important is the exact pronunciation of the original Hebrew name? Could we get sidetracked by trying to determine what that pronunciation was? Well, first of all, let's establish why we use the pronunciation Jehovah in English. Is it because it's the closest pronunciation to the original? No. We use the name Jehovah because it's widely recognized in English. Is this a reasonable position to take? Yes.
What I find most interesting about this clip is that Jeffrey Jackson teases Jehovah's Witnesses with questions which you would presume you'd get a logical, reasonable answer, but you actually get exactly the opposite. He asks the question, just how important is the exact pronunciation of the original Hebrew name? Every Jehovah's Witness is thinking, well, this should be the most important thing. We are Jehovah's Witnesses. It's in the name of our religion. He then asks, is it because Jehovah is the closest pronunciation to the original? Yes, it better be, because I'm saying it every day to other people. I'm saying it in my prayer. I'm talking to my friend, Jehovah. And then he says, no. Now, what's the real reason they don't change the name to Yahweh? Well, quite evidently, they would have to change the name of their religion to Yahweh's Witnesses. They'd have to change their entire Bible translation, all of their written material, and they'd have to hold their hands up and say for 150 years, the God who's been guiding them with his Holy Spirit to produce their material forgot to say, guys, you've got my name wrong. It's actually Yahweh. It would be a humiliation for them. Speaking of things they got horrifically wrong, looking back in time this is, Riley, shocking quote number 4, let's go racism, with a very interesting question that the organisation decided to tackle.
So the question is there anything in the Bible that reveals the origin of the Negro? And this is their answer. It is generally believed that the curse which Noah pronounced upon Canaan was the origin of the black race. Certain it is that when Noah said, "Cursed be Canaan, a servant of servants shall he be unto his brethren," he pictured the future of the coloured race. They have been and are a race of servants. But now in the dawn of the 20th century, we are all coming to see this matter of service in its true light, and to find that the only real joy in life is serving others, not bossing them. There is no servant in the world as good as a good coloured servant, and the joy that he gets from rendering faithful service is one of the purest joys there is in the world.
There's no servant in the world as good as a good coloured servant. That hasn't aged well, has it?
No, and I'm sure this is extremely embarrassing for the organisation.
But I mean, this is just all over the place in so many different directions. It's a humiliation, but for me, I mean, I know that was your most extreme racist quote from them. For me, it gets worse with number 3, which I've called Racism Segregated Photo Drama from Watchtower 1914. Now, for those that don't know, the photo drama of creation was a set of slides they set up in theatres, basically cinemas, in order to encourage the public. This was groundbreaking at the time. Get the public in, as much of the public as possible, to see this amazing promotion that they'd put on to try and encourage people to essentially become Jehovah's Witnesses. But there was an issue. There were too many black people. Whereas the coloured people of New York City are about 5% of the population, in our audiences, they're about 25%, and the number is increasing. What shall we do? I mean, what do they mean? Why is that a problem in the first place? As the attendance of the coloured people would increase, proportionately the number of the whites would decrease. For explain it how we will, a majority of whites prefer not to intermingle closely with other races, recognising that it meant either the success or the failure of the enterprise of the drama, not the feelings of those who are being told what's going to come next, but the success or failure of the enterprise of the drama as respects the whites. We have been compelled to assign the coloured friends to the gallery, which, however, is just as good for seeing and hearing as the other parts of the temple. Some were offended at this arrangement. No, I'll tell you this for sure. All were offended, but only some let their offence be known to the whites. We again suggest that if a suitable place could be found in which the drama could be presented for the benefit of the coloured people alone, we'd be glad to make such arrangements. Now, this was in 1914. This is a year of significance for Jehovah's Witnesses. Jesus and Satan clashed. Satan was thrown down to earth. Jesus was starting to have a look round for his organisation. So if you believe that Jesus was at some point having any influence on this organisation in 1914, he was taking the organisation backwards in America to a time of true segregation and real hatred and racism. Let's move on from that. I'm sure it's got a lot of you angry, just as it has me and Riley. We go from 1914 to this summer's 2022 convention that was released recently, where we have a quote by Stephen Lett. Jehovah is the God who gives peace is the talk. Let's roll the VT for what he said.
Now, if we think about it, we're not born as friends of God because we're born as sinful offspring of Adam. Actually, if we think about it, we're born as enemies of God. Sometimes you'll hear people say of a little baby, "Look at that little angel." But more accurate would be to say, "Look at that little enemy of God."
This clip is so crazy, and not only is it crazy, it's abhorrent, and it's also contradictory when you compare it to certain things that the organisation has said about children in the past. I mean, I grew up with the old Brown songbook, and I remember a song from that songbook, "Children are precious gifts from God." I can almost remember that song word for word. How do you reconcile that with what Stephen Lett has just said?
And I do think, imagine being someone in the organisation and you've just lost a child. Perhaps it was a miscarriage, perhaps you lost a toddler. Perhaps one of the worst things you could ever go through as a human being. And you're told that your infant, your baby, died as an enemy of God. How does that affect you? If you're a full believer, of course we realise this is nonsense, but if you're a full believer, go back, if you're an exjw watching this, go back to having the mindset of a believer. and then ask, how would that affect you if I was in that circumstance? Because there's a saying, whatever you tell a child is what they will become. If you feed them up all the time, you're the best footballer in your year, you're going to make it as a professional, they will go around saying, I'm the best footballer, my dad thinks I'll make it as a professional. If you tell a child they're a piece of on the bottom of your shoe, they'll go around hanging their head low because they feel useless, worthless, and of no value and significance in the world. That's how it affects them. Now picture Jehovah's Witness children at home. They're watching this and they're hearing that children and babies are born as enemies of God. They're automatically thinking, okay, how do I change that? How do I go about being a friend of God? So for me, this is twisted, because as we know, the only way you can ever draw close to God properly is to get baptized, and even then it's not a guarantee because you have to tick all these 10 boxes. So the child's already thinking, how do I get into this organization? They're already setting you on the path. God's enemies are babies, and that links in nicely to number 1. Now it's time for what we believe to be the most shocking Jehovah's Witness quote of all time. From time to time, letters are received asking whether a certain circumstance would justify making an exception to the Christian's obligation to tell the truth. In reply to these, the following is given. God's word commands, speak truth, each of you, with his neighbour. There is one exception, however, that the Christian must ever bear in mind. As a soldier of Christ, he is in theocratic warfare. He must exercise added caution when dealing with God's foes. Thus, the scriptures show that for the purpose of protecting the interests of God's cause, the organisation, Jehovah's name, it is proper to hide the truth from God's enemies. Someone might say, oh, okay, well, yeah, that makes sense. Satan is God's enemy. But as we've just looked at in number 2, babies are God's enemies. God's enemy is essentially anyone who is not baptized and set up in some sort of capacity within the organisation. Involved in being God's enemies are those in positions of worldly oversight and organisation, such as the police, such as secular authorities. What does this mean? This means that when there's instances of child sexual abuse and other crimes going on within the organisation, they don't have to tell the authorities the truth. They don't have to give their records. They don't have to be completely transparent, as everyone should be with regards to these serious crimes and issues, because they're dealing with God's foes. These are people set up in Satan's wicked system of things. Riley, I know you agreed with me when I put this sword as being the number 1 most shocking quote of all time. Do you have anything to add to that?
I think that this quote is hypocritical in the extreme, and it's also very contradictory as well. I mean, as a child, I remember growing up hearing that Satan is the father of the lie. If you tell lies, you're a child of Satan. But here the organisation is giving a free pass to anyone to tell lies as long as it's in service of the organisation. I mean, they're making it okay to employ Satan's tactics, for what they perceive to be the greater good.